Welcome to Watchtower History. The book White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America says, anti-Semitic tropes emerge that still circulate today, as mainstream Americans voice concerns about the influence of Jews over the American economy and banks in particular. In 1896, Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan stoked nativist worries about economic instability by invoking biblical imagery in a screed against U.S. banks. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. And remember, we were showing that cross of gold in one of the political cartoons from the Populist Party earlier. The anti-Semitism evoked by the metaphor of the crucifixion was powerful and spread and appealed to rural Protestants in the South and the West. That also matches what we found, because those conspiracy letters, those forged letters, only appeared in the South and in the populist papers. A minister in Detroit proclaimed that Jews constituted a greater threat to the United States than the Yellow Peril, evoking fears that the new Jewish immigrants would destroy America's grand Christian civilization. Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company, became a strong believer in the anti-Semitic idea of a global conspiracy of Jews attempting to control the world's financial resources. He bought a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, a copy of which was distributed to every person who bought a Ford automobile.
Now, again, we're not stating that there isn't financial giant corporations and corrupt politics. We're not stating that. What we are stating, though, is it's not backed by this global Jewish conspiracy of people who got together to under Jewry to take over the world. So those things are going on, but just not the way they're trying to put the spin on it.
What we're trying to show is at least what Watchtower is pointing at, what Watchtower was using to suggest their own conspiracy, were these conspiracies from the Populist Party. These can't be backed by the facts of history. These are proven forgeries. And this is something that the Populist Party of the time period loved to do. Henry Ford, also a friend of William Jennings Bryan, was also a member of the Populist Party, very influenced by the Populist Party. So the newspaper, Ford's newspaper, trafficked in anti-Semitic stories, including promoting the protocols of the Elders of Zion, a spurious tract purported to be the Jewish blueprint for world financial domination. All right, so we're going to get into that in a little bit, but before we get there, we're going to take you back to one of our earlier stories that we talked about in a previous discussion. In 1918, a lawyer and his friends were sent to prison by a military court for a crime of insurrection. These men were released from an Atlanta penitentiary to the New York suburb. Today, it is claimed that in the 1930s they hired machine guns to protect them from intolerance at a New Jersey public gathering. Is this a real problem? Did this really happen? If it did or didn't, can we find the real truth about the Watchtower team? Intolerance, machine guns, and the Watchtower? This question was sent to us by one of our viewers, and they were asking us to look into this story about Rutherford and machine guns. And a book review was sent on demythologizing the legal history, Jehovah's Witnesses and the First Amendment.
Was there anything in particular the viewer wanted to know about this subject?
Are there photos? Does anyone have more to the story?
That's an interesting pick for a topic from a viewer. Usually it's more doctrine oriented that you've gotten emails, we've gotten emails for, but I like this. This is, once again, history and going back into things.
So in this book review, there's a sentence here that says, at one convention, Rutherford had the stage surrounded by machine guns in order to protect himself from the Catholic hierarchy. At another, he had special lookouts on the roof, watching out for airplanes sent by the witnesses' enemies to bomb the building. What's the story?
The first one is almost believable, but to think that even a government back then in this country to bomb buildings because of him is kind of a little far-fetched, maybe even a little paranoid, if he believed it, unless he was just trying to stir up media attention. I didn't think airplanes would bomb a building in our U.S. military planes would bomb a building at that time, especially in this country, over him.
Well, that's the start of that second paragraph, right? This paranoid thinking extended to the legal dimension.
And the doctrinal dimension.
Well, where did that all come from? Again, we've said this several times before on the channel. This paranoid thinking came from this whole reconstruction of a new doctrinal and prophetic scheme by Rutherford and his friends that made everything so egocentric to themselves. All prophecy was about Watchtower society after 1914 and especially after 1919. And when all the nations come against Jerusalem into battle in those prophecies, of course, the Jehovah's Witnesses apply that to themselves. So they have this paranoia that at some point in the future, everyone's coming after them. And their entire doctrinal scheme is based on that particular subject, on that particular interpretation. This story originates out of one of the bulletins for Jehovah's Witnesses. This one happened to be December 1st, 1933 issue. And like everything else, Rutherford liked to use the things that happened to him, the things that happened to the Bible students, but specifically the things that happened to Rutherford himself, and he would use those things to his advantage. This proves we're Jehovah's organization because look at what they're doing to us. Jesus said there would be persecution, and we're the only ones being persecuted. Except they're not the only ones being persecuted. It's that paranoia mentality again. The stirring speech on religious intolerance delivered by Brother Rutherford at Plainfield, New Jersey, before machine guns and a house full of strong-armed Ethiopians with glistening revolvers, is to be broadcast throughout the country on Sunday, December 31st. There are hundreds of radio stations and portable transcription machines going to carry this very important lecture on that date. This message is the most pointed and clear-cut declaration of the Lord against the institution of Satan, particularly the Catholic hierarchy, delivered up to that time. We believe that this will make a tremendous impression throughout the country and be very instrumental in causing many to don their garments, manifesting where they stand in the great issue.
Now, what city did this take place in?
Plainfield, New Jersey.
Okay, so there were in Plainfield, New Jersey, not only were there warplanes, there were machine guns, and there were also armed Ethiopians in there. Where did that one come from? That's an interesting one. Where did what at the time, was there some Ethiopian gang somewhere in New Jersey going on doing something? Because that is even odd for this. Do you know, or?
I thought New York was the dangerous place, but Jersey?
I grew up down in that area as a boy, and I never recalled hearing of horrible Ethiopian gangs and anything like that. I don't know where that one came from personally.
I wonder if it's a racist comment. Possibly. It's some kind of derogatory statement. Notice he put it in quotes. So. It's typical of the Rutherford era, how he describes those that are against him. This story was also published in the Golden Age of January 31st, 1934. Where was the world in 1933 in regards to the war or history? World War II didn't start until 1939. Hitler was just coming to power in 1933. He wasn't even on the radar as much then as he became later on, especially in the later years. Wasn't he elected chancellor in January of 1933?
It was early on.
Yeah.
Well before 1939 and all that came to fruition. And then he slowly, with Mein Kampf and through his works, gained control of the Socialist Political Party. And yeah, so that was well before the war. He set some footwork.
And we know Herbert Hoover of the FBI had a file on Rutherford. We have some of that file in our documentation. So Rutherford was being followed. But what was the instance here that caused this issue? I don't have the answer to that.
Well, you can't answer everything that they've done. I mean, you could point to the facts and what surrounds it, but you can't always find a reason for why they have done certain things in the past or will do so in the future.
This is also in the middle of the Great Depression. There would have been a lot of people out of work, a lot of very hungry people, and looking for some type of message. Rutherford was trying to deliver a message to prove they were the one true church, the one true organization that Jehovah had appointed. And this persecution mentality, this persecution complex, was right up his alley. He knew how to advertise to use those kind of situations to his advantage. At a certain point, the radio stations got tired of his diatribe, and they just stopped allowing him to buy radio time in order to proclaim his hate-filled speeches over the public airwaves.
Which is something that they don't talk about. It's all the presentations given, but not, okay, we don't want to hear it anymore, and we don't like what you're saying. And it's even controversial. And religion and Bible truth, the controversy it's supposed to stir up is not a hatred controversy and us against them. It's a question of who's right to rule. Is it Jesus' kingdom or man? And that can be done peaceful while people are not liking you at the same time. So his method of public dissemination of his views were questionable.
But he did it purposely because the things that he did, or the things that happened to them, made the news. And they made sure that it made the news. Because if it gets in the news, that's free advertising, right? And it puts them on everyone's radar. So the April 1st, 1939 Watchtower gives a little bit of the story here. And it says, September 1st to 29th, 1933, a special campaign by Jehovah's Witnesses was carried forward, in which they distributed a large amount of literature exposing the scriptural denunciation of the religionists, the Roman Catholic hierarchy. For Rutherford, everything was the Roman Catholic hierarchy at the time.
Even as a boy, in the 70s, growing up, I remember my grandmother, they were very proud of the announcements they gave and what they said against the Catholic Church in particular. They fixated on the Catholic Church. And also, as the article states, in there, Joshua's orders were carried out exactly as given. They're putting them in a position where they are the new Joshua, the new anti-type of the type.
Yes, and that was Rutherford's scheme again to prove, hey, we're the chosen ones. And by the way, I'm the one taking the lead of the organization, so I'm the chosen one. Back to that sheep and goats discussion that we had. And they take the things that happened to them and they start applying it to various Bible stories and saying, hey, that's a type of us. And it proves we're Jehovah's chosen organization. Of course, most of those types have been dropped. And even a few years ago, they had an article saying that they stopped using types. I think they realized that that just doesn't work.
But I thought it was those types that made them chosen and passed over for inspection.
That's another discussion for another time. Jim Penton, while he was still a Jehovah's Witnesses, wrote a book called Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada, champions of freedom of speech and worship. And he talks about this. In July, he released the booklet Intolerance in relation to the New Jersey situation, after having delivered the text as a public talk, also widely broadcast at Plainfield, New Jersey, while police machine guns were pointed at his back. In order to carry Rutherford's message as contained in Intolerance, and in a similar booklet, The Crisis throughout the United States, some 12,600 American witnesses volunteered to invade unfriendly communities by the hundreds to contact people in every home. Late in the year and early in 1934, these same door-to-door preachers and many others circulated a petition vigorously protesting against Catholic intimidation and threats of freedom of speech over the radio. So again, Rutherford used the story to his advantage and pushed the followers more to press the message, thus infuriating the public and causing more persecution and more things to happen to them, proving that they're the chosen organization because they're being persecuted. He's creating a news story almost purposely.
He could have, for that matter, he could have even chosen the American government instead of the Catholic Church and riled the people up, and they would have thought the same thing. They're attacking us, so it's not just, we're not just trying to talk about the Catholic Church. We're trying to point out that they could have created any obstacle or persecutor to go against them, and a lot of people were just followed and believed now this is the new type, and once again, this is what caused all this.
And there are many who believed it. They followed him in droves. It seemed logical to some, but some are afraid to question, and he created an atmosphere where you couldn't question it. Yeah. And so if you kept your mouth shut and several years go by, several generations, that's how you get from Rutherford's era to where we are now. And that persecution mentality still continues, but so does that control, where public questioning, something here doesn't quite logically make sense, or it doesn't look contextual from the scriptures, something doesn't fit here. What if we look at this from another way? You can't do that.
Now, in their defense, not to say, give a good rapport on some of the stuff that Rutherford and the witnesses did at that time. It is pretty well known, that they were quite champions of Supreme Court decisions for rights for people and freedom of speeches. And a lot of this had to do with what he was doing back then. It wasn't popular, a lot of it, because back then it was wartime or pre-war time, or coming from war, watching a war that is going to happen in Europe. And we didn't have the technology and the surveillance and the means to conduct a reconnaissance and all that. Back then, it was more foot. It was people. There were spies. There were Russian agents and interference in the government.
The 007 of Plainfield, New Jersey.
Like back in World War II, when Japan was going, we were going to war with them, there were claims of using carrier pigeons and all kinds of stuff to the California, to the West Coast, in contacting the larger Japanese population to find out, hey, what are the Americans doing? What are other newspapers saying? So when they were going anti-war and going all this against everything America stood for and was paranoid for, it wasn't a message of peace. It was a message of dissension in reality.
There's an excellent book called Judging Jehovah's Witnesses that looks at a lot of these cases that the Jehovah's Witnesses fought in the courts in order to get their freedom to preach. And they did amazing in winning the majority of those cases, and they changed the landscape of the courts through the work that they did. Did they do it because they were patriots? Did they do it because they loved the United States? No, they did it because they were looking out for themselves. It benefited America, I think, but I think it was a selfish motive.
And that's even open for a discussion whether it benefited or did not. But we'll talk about that another time if you want.
The booklet that he wrote on the subject was Intolerance. And you can see in the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Divine Purpose history book that was done in the 50s, they have a little thumbnail of that. And they mention here again, as he walked onto the platform, he saw that the police had 2 machine guns behind the drapes. Now it's 2. So didn't quite mention the number before. These machine guns were so placed that they would be forced to speak directly in front of them as they were trained on him and the audience. This made Judge Rutherford extremely angry, but his vigorous protests failed to budge the police or their guns. They said that they had been tipped off that there was going to be a riot, and they were there to maintain order. But regardless of what their intentions might have been, the talk was delivered without incident and enthusiastically received, as was the booklet Intolerance, later published and widely distributed.
So in 1933, they didn't know how many machine guns there were. But years later, they were able to determine how many they were.
And they said that they got tipped off that there was going to be a riot. So they were there to protect Rutherford and the audience.
I thought they were there because they were against Rutherford.
Yeah, let's go on and read a little bit further, right? So here's Rutherford's side of the story in the booklet. The chief of police, a Roman Catholic. The Roman Catholic hierarchy, right? Just because the chief of police was a Roman Catholic, tried to prevent this meeting from being held. On the day before this speech was to be delivered, a number of Christian men and women were distributing small handbills announcing a time and place of the meeting. This they had a perfect right to do, as there is no ordinance in Plainfield and no other law that prohibits such distribution. Besides, it was done for the people who might wish to come. Without any lawful right or excuse, the distributors of these handbills were arrested by police officers and thrown into jail. Shortly thereafter, police officers near the jail were heard discussing the matter of the distribution of these announcements that Judge Rutherford would speak the next day at the Strand Theater, and one was heard to say to another, "He will be here tomorrow, and he will get what's coming to him." So now this is hearsay. He's publishing in the booklet. He's publishing hearsay.
Now, here's a fact, okay? The Catholic Church at that time did protest against the Jehovah's Witnesses. They did. You can't question that. But once again, let's ask the question, why were they doing that? What instigated that? Well, if they were just going out passing pamphlets of their belief, nobody really would have bothered them. But when you're singling out the Catholic Church, well, now they're going to react and have a reaction toward what you're saying against them. If I had an opinion about something, you would allow it. But if I had that opinion toward you specifically, I don't like it because Jeff is doing this, you'd be, hey, wait, this is why I do it. So the Catholic Church, in defending them in this, is they really didn't instigate the fight or the conflict between them. Did they respond accordingly? Yes. And there are stories of Jehovah's Witnesses being tarred and feathered around the country. But if they weren't causing a conflict, nobody just would have went out and said, hey, he's a Jehovah's Witness, let's tar and feather him. So they brought, and once again, advertise. That makes the paper. You know, everybody wants to read about why someone's being tarred and feathered.
Yeah.
I mean, if it happened today,
every day. Right?
Yeah, exactly. When you see that, it's like, oh, what'd that guy do? So there's reasons for all this, and we're not picking on Jehovah's Witnesses, nor are we picking on Catholics, but we're going to put it in a fair light. And this part of it wasn't included in the insight books and all the divine purpose. It was more or less instigated by the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Back to the booklet. He gives more of the story. Here he says, 2 hours before the time for this meeting to begin, armed policemen began to arrive at the theater. No one invited them to come, and no request had been made for any police protection, and none was needed because it was a peaceable assembly for the discussion of the Bible, the discussion of the Bible matter, which the Constitution of the United States guarantee shall be held without interruption. Manifestly at the instance of cruel religionists, these law officers were there, more than 60 in number, armed with heavy revolvers, sawed-off shotguns, riot guns, and other instruments of destruction. Just before the beginning of the lecture, police officers made an effort to provoke Judge Rutherford to a controversy, with the manifest purpose of finding some excuse to prevent the meeting. But in this they had no success. When Judge Rutherford stepped to the front of the platform to speak, he was literally surrounded by armed men, as though he were a desperate criminal. With guns in the back of him, and in front of him, and on every side, he delivered the speech which you now are about to read. The judge of the court who had conducted the farce trial, and who at the time had indulged in cruel and improper speech toward the defendants, and who had defamed the name of Jehovah by his public declarations, was immediately in front of the speaker and was compelled to listen, together with the officers who were doing the bidding of the Roman hierarchy. So now we have a lot more than 2 machine guns that are mentioned in the other article. Why does the story keep changing?
And to an extent, it almost looks like they're creating another mini Cedar Point, Ohio event. Like this was an important event that took place. Really, let's say it did happen. Let's say they were there. It's common at concerts, at other rallies and different things for the police, especially if they believe others might come and instigate your peaceful protest. So they very likely were just there, hey, look, this could get out of hand if other people show up. Let's have some police there just to cover up. So it wasn't a specific, in my opinion, and I'm going to say that's my opinion, I don't think it was a specific act against them as much as maybe let's prevent a riot from getting out of control.
Yeah, and that's how the Divine Purpose book explains the story. They were there to protect Rutherford and protect against a riot.
That's not what it says there.
It's not what it says here. There's a complete different story.
Exactly.
That's only a couple decades apart, right?
So then which one are we supposed to believe now?
Exactly.
Was he being protected, or was there a riot? What's going on?
I'm glad you asked that question, because there are some Jehovah's Witness historians who discuss this in their book. Bruce Schultz and Rachel Devine, in their Separate Identity, Volume 2, Organizational Identity Among Readers of Zion's Watchtower, 1870 to 1887, Volume 2, Culture and Organization. That's quite a mouthful for a title. This idea that Rutherford had the machine guns comes from Stoops' book. And so Bruce and Rachel's idea here in their preface, page 19, says the charitable view is that Stroop was a careless listener. He took from conversations what he wanted, ignoring their real content. The far less charitable view is that he did as elsewhere in his book. He just made it up to suit his agenda. We know from his footnotes that he read most, if not all, of the available Watchtower booklets, though he cites them by chapter name and not their proper title. Rutherford's booklet Intolerance describes fully what happened, and then that's what we had read. Stroop would have found this available at the meetings he attended, along with the other publications he acquired and read. Instead of protecting Rutherford, the officers were there to intimidate him and Watchtower adherents. And while there were 2 machine guns, they did not line into the theater. Wait a minute, didn't that Jehovah's Witness and the Divine Purpose book state that they were there to protect them? Now, they're
And then it changed
mixing these-
again. At one point, there was one in front, one behind. Then there were two behind. So there were
several around. You sawed off shotguns, revolvers, and pistols.
Ethiopians.
His conclusion is the entire story is told by Stroop as unethical, inaccurate, and meant to mislead. When we look at the several times that the story is mentioned, the story keeps evolving even within the Watchtower literature itself. So it's interesting that you have to put all these stories together to get a full picture of what happened. But how do you do research? I think you've got to look at primary sources. Not hearsay.
So what is the primary resource in this instance?
I'm glad you asked. So in this book review that was sent to us by our listeners, it's quoting from Stroop's book. And it's mentioning that it comes from note 27 and note 29. So if we go and look at Stroop's book, here's the pages that are quoted in this book review and in that other book. The book doesn't say that Rutherford had the guns placed there for his protection, only that they were there for his protection. Stroop isn't exactly clear what he's saying, so I think it could be read to understand that the police had guns there to protect Rutherford. But the spin that it's put on from this story and this telephone game is, it keeps going from one book to another book. It keeps changing. Not only in the history books that are against the Watchtower Society, but also we see the story changing when the Watchtower Society itself repeats the story. So I think this is the spin that this story puts on both sides of it makes it interesting, very, very interesting.
So in one aspect, it's for protection. Another aspect, it's for antagonizing.
Yes. I think the whole point of why we decided to look at this is because there are so many different stories told about the Watchtower Society from within the organization and without. And you can look at the history books, you can get various takes on it, but unless you go to the primary sources, as close as you can as possible, you can't get the full story, and you got to look at all sides of the story. I know that a lot of the Jehovah's Witness materials, they can't look at apostate material, so it would be difficult for them to look at Penton's book, Apocalypse Today,
or
right?
so-called claimed apostate material.
Yeah.
Not apostate material. That's open for reasoning and discussion on that. I will not claim.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I will not claim somebody wrote an apostate book. If they're telling the truth, what's apostate about it?
Right. That's a very valid point. As much as possible, gather both sides of the story. That's true for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. That's true for Jehovah's Witnesses. That's true for those of us who are neutral and in between. We've never been a Jehovah's Witness, so, if you can get the primary sources, the documentation, if you can get both sides of the story, put them all together and try and get the whole facts to the story. Primary sources is the key. I think that's the lesson of this story. If this story was so important and so big, why is it not mentioned in any newspapers? I wasn't able to find even one. If there are any out there, just please let us know. It would be interesting to see something to as close a first-hand account as possible. Like many things, Rutherford took something small and exaggerated it to make a point. We saw this in the sheep and the goats discussion, where Rutherford basically said, "It's all about me." Here he does exactly the same thing.
So are you going to answer the question, who's right?
I think, Stroop's book, which is quoted by this other book that's having the book review that mentions this story, it's that telephone game. So I think the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Divine Purpose book is probably the closest to the truth. I don't think it's as exaggerated as the story Rutherford put out. Early on, they back off of that story. And remember, in the early 50s, when they did this book, there would have been people who would have been there. And so they could have given a more first-hand account of the story. So it looks to me to be the most accurate. So I'll chalk one up for the Jehovah's Witnesses on this one. I think that particular book presents the closest to the story. Your opinion, Paul?
I don't know if I can give a full opinion on it. There's just too many versions for me to say, okay, Jehovah Witness one is right. No, this guy's right. There's just too many versions. I'm going to stick with the telephone line one on this one, that there might have been guns present where the whole thing got blown out of hand. That's what I really think it is. And they made an event out of something that was just, the police were there at, like they are at every other event, and they turned it into a Cedar Point moment. Yeah. And that's my take on it.
And I think that's where I would fault the Jehovah's Witnesses. Why take the story now and make it a type and say, here's a Bible story that prophesied that this was going to happen to us, and this is what this is what happened, and here's the Bible story that proves it, proves where his organization. That's taking it even a step further. So if you're already prone to exaggeration by applying prophecies to yourselves, how can we trust that primary source when we know it's already prone to exaggeration? So when they tone the story back a couple decades later, it's probably closer to the truth than the way it was repeated to begin with, and the way it's turned into something completely different by some of these Watchtower historians. So if you remember, we had this story about intolerance, machine guns, and the Watchtower. And there is this Father Coughlin who was provoking a protest with Rutherford's speech in the 1930s. And there is this question about, well, who had machine guns? How many were there? Who were they pointed at? Were they pointed at Rutherford? Were they pointed at the crowd? We went into all of that. The reason we bring this up is because it's similar to another Catholic clash with Rutherford and the Jehovah's Witnesses a few years later with Father Coughlin. This is where Rutherford and Coughlin's story begin to intersect. Partly because of what happened here, and partly because of the hate speech, which both Rutherford and Coughlin were pushing on the radio at the time. Both Coughlin and Rutherford were banned from many radio stations across the country. At this point, the Jehovah's Witnesses went door to door promoting Coughlin's radio programs as a means to open the door, as it were, to get people to think about freedom of speech on the radio. And it did get people talking about it in multiple letters to the editors across the United States. In one of these types of letters to a Catholic paper called The Tablet, a writer stated that Rutherford was bigoted to an extreme, and granted also that his broadcasts frequently contain inaccurate and even slanderous statements concerning the Catholics. A little further down it says, the point involved, it seems to me, is whether we are not harming ourselves by attempting to stifle all criticism. For admittedly, there are some who believe, as does Judge Rutherford, and it is surely neither fair nor Christian to deny them their right to listen to his discourses if they so wish. The recent attempt to stop Father Coughlin is a case in point of the same intolerant attitude. Only in this case, we in the church were on the other side of the argument. What Rutherford and the Jehovah's Witnesses were doing to incite this discussion was going door to door and promoting Coughlin's programs. Another newspaper report said that the common practice, judging from the different reports, is to circulate the petition through agents who go from door to door. In Cleveland, the report from that city states, an agent began his talk to a Catholic housekeeper in this way. Madam, you are a friend of Father Coughlin, aren't you? You don't want him taken off of the air, do you? Well, I have a petition right here for you to sign. We must protect the rights of the common people. The housekeeper, becoming suspicious, asked, aren't you one of the Watchtower people? The solicitor admitted the charge, and fled. Now, this all escalated to the point where Rutherford and Watchtower attempted to promote a freedom of speech bill to Congress, and they went as far as dragging in the president of the Federal Council of Churches and the presidents of CBS and NBC and accused them of belonging to a worldwide conspiracy that Rutherford, Ford, and Coughlin had been promoting. We'll get into that congressional record in a little bit. Stay tuned.
And as we said way back, we're going to take, there's a reason why we're showing and creating these other videos. We're taking it down a path of where Watchtower originated from.
So William J. Schnell, in his 30 Years a Watchtower Slave, mentions one of these things here as well. At the convention of 1939 in New York City, I had further occasion to bring myself unintentionally to the judge's attention. On the last days of the assembly held in Madison Square Garden, during the main talk by Judge Rutherford to a crowded-out garden, there was a riot and attempt to break up the meeting. We had been warned beforehand, and long before the assembly convened, some of us were selected and put in charge of flying squads. I had 15 men in my squad. Each of us was armed with a sturdy walking cane. I was assigned one of the rear balcony sections looking down upon the platform. As soon as the garden filled, we observed a large group of people streaming into the rear balcony. My section filled within minutes. I noticed that all of the people carried paper bags, which seemed filled with something, I knew not what. As I deliberately brushed against a woman, the bag fell from her hand and burst open, revealing that it held overripe tomatoes. Of course, we could do nothing yet, since no overt act had been committed. But we were alerted from that instant on. No sooner did the judge begin to speak than those carrying the paper bags began throwing vegetables at the platform below, while others stamped their feet and yelled loudly. Without a moment's hesitation, we waded into that crowd with canes swinging. Our section was cleared in 7 minutes flat. I broke my cane in two over somebody's skull and then used my fists. My shirt sleeves were torn off, and I had a few bruises. The talk went on after only a few minutes of pandemonium. So there were different stories, several stories like this happening in Watchtower.
And that proves persecution that they were chosen. He was chosen.
Yeah, there we go again.
You just know that to him, he's just glomming onto that, and it's press, it's attention.
So that NCWC News Service has an article. Rutherford Group loses damage suit. The suit for $100,000 brought by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society against His Eminence Dennis Cardinal Doherty, Archbishop of Philadelphia, and 2 priests of the Archdiocese has been resolved in favor of the cardinal and priests in court of the common pleas. The suit grew out of an address by Judge Rutherford, head of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which is broadcast over a local radio station. One of the priests wrote a letter of protest to the station broadcasting the address, with the result that Catholic clergymen were charged with a conspiracy to bring about a breach of the society's broadcasting contract. So again, Rutherford's claiming conspiracy. He lost the suit in court. Couldn't prove the conspiracy. There's a letter here from Rutherford to Olin Moyle, March 31st, 1938. He says, "Your report of the case in which the Catholic priest reportedly declined to testify until he could first consult with his bishop will be of interest to the people of goodwill, as well as to the remnant. Please write that up in the proper form and furnish it to the Consolation for publication at an early issue. This may help to encourage some of the other priests to consult the bishop before he's put on the witness stand. You want to take occasion to rub it into these roosters as much as possible, and wherever you have any intimation that a Catholic priest is back of the persecution of our people, summons that priest as a witness and put him on the stand and bore into his property." And so Rutherford, again, using these persecution stories as a means to advertise. Didn't matter if the accusation was true or not. It was free publicity, right?
Yep. And he wanted more of it. as the letter finishes. I want every case of the cases against the city manager, the chief of police, city attorney, commissioner, mayor, particularly the Catholic priest, and every SOB that incited the mob to see if we can't excite those roosters somewhat. Excite them? Is that another word for rile them up?
I think so. So, in order to try and get their story across, they would buy advertising space and try and make it look like it was a part of the newspaper. You could see there's a little snippet there. This letter was originally delivered in front of machine guns, armed men before an audience, which packed out the auditorium. It says, evidence of religious intolerance. And this is from the Marengo Beacon Republican News. This is Illinois, December 26, 1933. And they're trying to repeat some of these stories again. At that time, Judge Rutherford was in Europe and being informed of the persecution of these Christian people. Again, he was very concerned about what was going on with the brothers in Germany. He immediately cabled to engage the best auditorium in Plainfield, and certain radio stations to be used to convey his speech, which he would deliver to the people on the subject, why is religious intolerance practiced in this country today? When Judge Rutherford stepped up to the front of the platform to speak, he was literally surrounded by armed men as though they were a desperate criminal, with guns to the back of him and into the front of him and on every side. He delivered the speech, which you will have the privilege of hearing at the meeting. Again, we're not going to get into that here. Go and check our intolerance discussion where we post some of the evidence for or against that. I think you'll be very, very interested. But the reason we're bringing it up is that one of these, as mentioned, is this is instigated by Father Coughlin. Now, who was Father Coughlin? Father Coughlin was a friend of Henry Ford. Father Coughlin was a Catholic priest. He was another one of those who was preaching hate speech on the radio, and along with Rutherford was taken off the radio because of the hate speech. Father Coughlin was a white supremacist, a neo-Nazi. And just like William Jennings Bryan, Father Coughlin also advocated bimetallism, that silver and gold standard.
The banker is demanding that he retain his customary standard of living while he forces the laboring men of America by his cruel exploitation onto a wage level and a standard level that is just this side of the Bolshevik.
Father Coughlin called on Americans to take a stand for God and for country.
I ask you in the name of Christianity, which abhors communism, in the name of patriotism, which loved America to carry it on to victory, I ask you if you will rise in your places and pledge with me to restore America to the Americans.
Few voices in that troubled decade would sound so promising to so many Americans, or so threatening.
The priest was the person who came to your house for a sick call, and he's the person who consoled you in your grief and shared your joy of weddings and baptisms with you. But he wasn't on the radio talking to millions of people every day, blasting governments and ethnic groups and religions and making charges and making accusations. And I think he was an absolute departure from anything that we had seen in this country. A priest with the collar of the Roman Church on a platform screaming.
By 1936, he commanded a following that couldn't be ignored, not by politicians, nor by the media.
As another presidential election approaches, a Roman Catholic priest, for the first time in American history, is seriously involved in national politics.
Some are unpopular, but God hates the hypocrite.
At his shrine of the Little Flower near Detroit converge elements of a mighty political power. A power that grows with every name added to the 12 million already in his letter files. With every handshake that adds another individual to his colossal following, which he has welded into the most potent political lobby this country has ever known. The single-voiced, National Union for Social Justice.
It's easy to appeal to a mass audience, especially when you've got something to sell them. And he was selling them. He was selling hope. And he was selling a new deal for them without ever calling it that. You know, a distribution of the wealth, a fair shake for the people who don't have it, against these bloodsuckers, these communists. I mean, God, we were afraid of the communists. We knew what they were. They were godless. And you tell somebody in that era, in those conditions, that somebody was godless, say nothing else about them. We knew what they were.
People were ripe for somebody with answers. And a lot of people tried to have answers, but his were persuasive at the time because he was looking for the causes of unemployment. He was looking for the causes of social injustice. He had demons and evildoers that he could point fingers at, and they got more and more specific as he went on, as you know, and became ultimately those international Jewish communist bankers.
Again, now we're going back into the Depression when people were really waiting for a messiah of some sort.
By the early 30s, comedy and adventure had to compete with the drama of the radio priest. Coughlin made it to the top of the ratings and into the fan magazines.
I dim all the lights and I sink in my chair. The smoke from my cigarette climbs through the air. The walls of my room fade away in the blue, deep in a dream of you.
Radio held out the promise of opportunity, of celebrity and riches. Other religious voices were bound to be heard. In the worst of the Depression, Father Coughlin was spending thousands of dollars a week to broadcast over his own network. By radio and by mail, he'd assembled the biggest block in the history of Christianity. He'd done it without any clear political affiliation or program, his platform a political stew of contradictions. He was for and against the capitalist system, for and against Roosevelt and the New Deal, for and against the demands of labor. The radio priest could be many things to many people, and it paid off.
I don't think any of those old people then thought he was getting rich, but he was. He was getting a lot of money. He was getting 400,000 letters a week coming into his radio program, and and people stuffed money in it to help support it.
In money orders alone, he cashed $500,000 at the tiny Royal Oak Post Office in less than 2 years. Along with money, Coughlin was raising controversy. While advocating that silver replace the gold standard, he had a secretary invest in silver futures. While denouncing Wall Street, he kept his own account at Payne Weber.
He lived extremely well. They say he had a personal income and that he made some wise investments. How do you know where a person like Father Coughlin gets his money? I'm sure people donated a lot of money. I don't know where all that money went to.
The one thing that was important to the people who were listening, especially the Catholics, was that he was a priest, and that he spoke with the church's authority. And if he wasn't speaking with the church's authority, why the hell were they letting him speak and say these things?
In fact, Father Coughlin's political career was ringing bells of alarm inside the Catholic Church.
In Boston, revered old Cardinal O'Connell contemptuously refers to the Coughlin speeches as hysterical addresses and demagogic stuff. New York's Cardinal Hayes says nothing, but his expert on canon law announces that Father Coughlin has no business in politics. But in the Roman Catholic Church, a priest is answerable only to his immediate superior. And Father Coughlin's superior is his staunchest ally, 68-year-old Bishop Gallagher.
Father Coughlin has preached no heresy. I shall not interfere.
There was danger. Father Coughlin was in a stronger position probably at that time than Martin Luther had been centuries earlier. If he had 30 million listeners, if he could probably change a national election, or have a good chance to, though his effort was futile, I think that the church felt it's dangerous for him to have that much backing.
The times were ripe for a demagogue, and Father Coughlin was one of several who played on the Depression. I suspect if we had a Depression again of anything like that magnitude, we would have demagogues to rise out of it, you know.
In Royal Oak, the radio priest prepared for a new season, on more stations than ever before. And more than ever before, he preached a politics of fear.
There is nothing standing between our children and their enslavement to the fanatical regime of the Soviet except the cross of Christ and the principles of social justice.
Mr. Roosevelt is notorious for his unbounded friendship for the Bolsheviks of Soviet Russia and elsewhere.
Struck for you to take the offensive against the Bolsheviks in our midst, the pinks, the reds, the radicals.
Why, in our colleges and schools, in our pulpits and in our government, communism has taken hold today.
Clean out the Augean stables of labor that have been dirtied and defiled by communist leadership. Clean them out.
It wasn't the first Red Scare in American politics, and it wouldn't be the last. In the 30s, political tremors were being felt along an ideological fault line that ran from extreme right to extreme left. One of Coughlin's earliest political sermons was Christ or communism. For some, the only thing to fear was a revolution, a view formally endorsed by a congressional committee.
Although I am no alarmist and do not anticipate any revolution in this country this year or next year from communist sources, I do believe that their seditious activities and those of all of our enemies from within are far more serious to the welfare of our people and the maintenance of our republican form of government than all our possible enemies from without.
Fascism was another great fear and attraction of the 1930s.
During this last week of March 1934, troops bearing a foreign uniform have been drilling in 19 American cities. This membership card of the Friends of the New Germany bears the shield of the United States, over which has been placed the Nazi emblem. Hitlerism has invaded America.
Camp Siegfried, not Germany, but Long Island, New York.
Which way is the United States going to go? Is it going to go communist or is it going to go fascist? It's got to go one or the other. You really felt a great pressure to choose up sides and take one side or the other. And a lot of people quite seriously thought, well, fascism is better than communism.
If not thunder on the extreme right, there was a rumbling, an incessant drumbeat. The German-American Bund marched into Madison Square Garden with his own version of Americanism, and with its own American heroes and villains.
Ladies and gentlemen, you all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail.
But no, my friends, the press, the radio, and the cinema are in the hand of the Jews, and like Father Coughlin.
And one of its heroes was the radio priest. It was one of the tragedies of the Depression. For some among the dispossessed, the solution wasn't what to do, but who to blame. By the late 30s, Coughlin knew who they were.
The system of the international finance, which has crucified the world to the cross of depression, was evolved by Jews for holding the peoples of the world under control. This official paper prints the names of the Jewish bankers who helped to finance the Russian Revolution. I was shocked that the resources of this nation should be employed against the Hitler government on behalf of German Jews to settle an internal problem in Germany.
What though they accuse you of stirring up the multitudes? What though they maintain that you consort with sinners, be they Nazi or anti-Semitic or
And
whatnot?
if we must accept Jewish leadership, that leadership will be identified with Jesus Christ, whom the Jews repent.
Oh, the courageous Christians of America will not be intimidated by name-calling, such as anti-Semitic, or by threats of investigation, or by a prejudiced press.
I found out years later that the Jews were frightened by Coughlin, or they were frightened by the talk. I mean, what was going on in Europe, they knew. What was happening in Germany, they knew. And here's a man who was embracing Hitler, who was, and I don't know who said that there was an amazing similarity between the things Coughlin was saying and the things Hitler was saying at the same time. The same phrases, the same harangues.
While he said, I'm a friend of the Jews and I'm not an anti-Semite, on every page of Social Justice you found anti-Semitism. In his radio addresses you had to detect it much more than you did in Social Justice.
Social Justice, whose circulation reached as high as 1 million copies a week, did more than reprint Coughlin's sermons. It reprinted the Protocols of Zion, a faked document also used in Nazi Germany, claiming that Jews were plotting to take over the world. According to Social Justice, Jews had financed the Russian Revolution, and the fascist countries of Europe were simply one line of defense.
What could Father Coughlin possibly do to the Jews? Except turn somebody against them.
In groups like the Silver Shirts, the possibility became a reality.
This Los Angeles bookshop of the Silver Shirts, dispensing anti-Jewish propaganda, is one of many that have recently opened all over the country. Note the name, Aryan Bookstore. And nearby, a newsboy shouts his wares. The Silver Legion Ranger, a propaganda newspaper.
Late paper. Just out, late paper. Silver Ranger, late paper. Free speech stopped by Jew riot.
The politics of bigotry could include anti-Catholicism, as in the Black Legion, which had a chapter in Royal Oak, Michigan, but a message still familiar to Coughlin's supporters.
Mr. Luff, I understand that the Black Legion stands for pro-Americanism. Is that a fact?
That's right.
I understand also that it is opposed to Catholics, Jews, and Negroes. Is that a fact?
Not the individual, but the activities of any subversive foreign groups.
Well, are not Catholic, Jews, and Negroes Americans?
As individuals, yes, but as an organized group, no. They are known in this country as a foreign body. Defend the policy of myself and all loyal Americans to propound a pure doctrine of Americanism at all times. America for Americans.
America for Americans had become a warning, a battle cry, for the Silver Shirts, for the Black Legion, and for Father Coughlin and the Christian Front.
I take my stand beside the Christian fronters. I understand that units of the Christian Front have formed and are forming in New York City and elsewhere. Does that mean anything to you Bolsheviks? It is time to eradicate them mentally, spiritually, and physically from our... Where do you stand? What do you plan to do?
The extremism rejected by most of his listeners was embraced by thousands of Coughlin's more fanatical followers. In the rhetoric of the radio priest, they heard a call to arms. By the early 1940s, Americans would be marching to war against fascism. Father Coughlin's public career would end. So would an era most Americans would like to forget. The radio priest was silenced by the Catholic Church in 1942. That same year, the government revoked the mailing privileges of Social Justice magazine. Father Coughlin returned to his original calling and remained until his death a parish priest.
There's a newspaper that has a little political cartoon about Father Coughlin that I thought was quite interesting. This is the Kent Dater, April 1st, and I can't read the date. because it says, Father Coughlin, I will quote from Judge Rutherford. Why would Father Coughlin quote Judge Rutherford? Well, in trying to research what Father Coughlin might have quoted from Judge Rutherford, I found that Father Coughlin had quoted Judge Rutherford's Rothschild conspiracy letters. You know, those that were forgeries.
So once again, someone else grabbing the letters and publishing them.
And so when you see that these letters only appeared in the populist papers of the 1890s, then they start appearing again in the 1930s. Why did they start appearing again in the 1930s? Well, Rutherford saved the letters from the populist paper for 30 years before republishing it. And then the white supremacist neo-Nazis picked it up and started using it in their campaigns.
You can't make this up. You can't make it up. Literally from the 1800 populist movement, literally from that period, it goes to Rutherford in the vindication period, roughly the 30, and then later on, it continues again in the United States, passing the baton. And this time, a Catholic priest got it.
And we'll touch on this a little bit more in the future as we continue our discussion here. But, you know, there's again, as we said, Rutherford, both Rutherford and Father Coughlin were censored from the radio because of their hate speech. Michael Kazin has a book called The Populist Persuasion in American History. And in the book, he mentions Father Coughlin. He says, but according to Coughlin, the 1913 establishment of the Federal Reserve, a national banking network responsible only to other bankers, represented the money changers' ultimate triumph. Since then, they had been able, often at the behest of shadowy continental figures like the Rothschilds, to manipulate the stock market, to cause or stop panics, or even to drag the United States into World War I on the side of the British financial interests. The 1929 crash was their masterstroke. The plan was to create an artificial scarcity of money. Social Justice, Coughlin's paper, told its readers, but the Depression was proving to be the toxin that had finally awakened Americans to their condition of financial slavery. Quote, the sands of intrigue and evil manipulations, unquote. Coughlin stated confidentially in 1933, having filtered through the hourglass of their control. As empirical history, much less as crisis theory, this lurid tale was quite false. Yet it's a mistake to belittle it, as did Arthur Schlesinger Jr. with the quip, for Coughlin, economics was a minor branch of rhetoric. The radio priest was quite happy to separate himself from the corps of trained economists, few of whom had predicted a severe depression. Now, his facts were normally presented as a string of one-liners drawn from a pastiche of sources. The original populists, various muckrakers, the famous encyclicals, and an obscure secular rights analyst named Gertrude Coogan, whose 1935 book, Money Creators, posted a conspiracy by international financiers to keep Americans in perpetual debt. Again, more of these kind of stories. 3 held in riot at Bible rally. 3 held in assault at religious meeting. Religious rally causes big fight. There are a lot of newspaper reports about this. That Father Coughlin instigated against the Watchtower Society, against Rutherford. But it's interesting because they're publishing some of the same things, which is a little bizarre. But
yeah, but remember, Rutherford is against the Catholic Church.
Yes, and he's a Catholic, yeah.
So what he's saying, you know, they're two identical people, them two. And Coughlin's not going to back down. Neither is Rutherford. So when one says something about him, he's going to come right back at him. So that was just meant to be.
What can take place in New York City? 40 hurt, 5 held as riot, halts, Bible conclave, trio held for assault, and religious cult riot. I'm going to read a little bit from this article. This is from the Tablet in Brooklyn, New York, August 19, 1939. And this was during that Rutherford's Peace and Government lecture. We didn't see any policemen inside the garden. Instead, the aisles seemed to be swarming with ushers, each one carrying a curved handle cane. We hadn't been there longer than 15 minutes when someone who evidently objected to what was being said let out a boo at the speaker. Well, things started to happen at that moment, as if by prearrangement. Lights were turned off only in that section of the balcony where we sat. Then the ushers started to use the curved handles of the canes to pull people out of their seats. They proceeded to strike them with the canes and push them down the stairs. I was terrified at what was happening. Finally, we left our seats and started for the stairway. There was a crowd of ushers near the stairs, pushing a woman around. We tried to get past them, but as we did so, one of the ushers, William Heath Jr., from the Coca-Cola family, right, rushed out of the crowd and holding a cane with both hands, he brought it down on my husband's head with full force, breaking the cane with the force of the blow. And that was just similar to the other story we saw where the other guy had done the same thing. And then he started using his fist.
Okay, but here it seems like the other people started the riot. When you go according to William Schnell, he said that they began throwing vegetables, stamped their feet, and yelled loudly. Okay, no one swung or did anything, yelled loudly. Within a moment's hesitation, we, the Rutherford bunch, waded into the crowd with canes swinging. So they started.
But it also depends. What section were they in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the only thing that prevented my husband's skull from being split open by the blow was the fact that he was wearing his hat at the time. Blood was streaming down his face, and I was nearly hysterical by that time. The usher started to run away, but the crowd held on to him until the police were summoned from downstairs. And then it says there, the attacker, William Heath Jr., was taken along in handcuffs. By 11 o'clock that Sunday night, we got out of night court. Newspaper headlines screamed, Coughlinites, again, Father Coughlin, invade garden, start riot. My husband's name was in the newspapers, not as a citizen who had been ruthlessly assaulted, but as a Coughlinite, whatever that is, who had started a riot. Since then, we've been persecuted like no European refugee has ever been persecuted. Some Jewish tenants in our building started a petition and got signatures presented that petition. Our landlord saying that he should throw us out of the building because they say we're Nazi fascist, Coughlinite Jew haters.
The same thing that Rutherford was being called. So,
oh my gosh. There's more articles here on the same story. The Tablet from Brooklyn, New York, March 10th, 1934. It's not the same exact story, but there's a similar accusation. And there were no guns. The Catholic Advance in Wichita, Kansas has this article, Judge Rutherford to open lectures. This is from July 16th, 1938. And this newspaper article was another similar instance to what Rutherford's asking for. Judge Rutherford, world-famous author and lecturer on Bible topics, will give a series of important lectures beginning tomorrow. The first lecture will be the famous Plainfield one entitled, Why Religious Intolerance is Practiced Now in This Country. This lecture was originally delivered in front of riot guns, sawed-off shotguns, and scores of armed men to an audience which packed out the auditorium. And on the right is a letter to the editor from the Tablet in Brooklyn, New York. This is from December 3rd, 1938. Dear Sir, the secular press is doing its part in placing Father Coughlin in an unfavorable position and as a promoter of anti-Semitism. Well, we've talked about that a little bit already, that he was quite anti-Semitic. In today's copy of the Daily News, the headline on page 6 states, Coughlin repeats his charge against Jews. By glancing at this, the reader gets the impression that Father Coughlin is an anti-Jew. The radio priest in his talk attacked all persuasion, Nazi and communist. The rise of Nazism and communism he attributed to a few atheistic Jews and Gentiles. By attacking communism strongly, Father Coughlin has been labeled a Nazi and Jew baiter. And so remember what Coughlin is doing and what some of the others have done, and what Rutherford was originally doing, was separating the religious Jew from the commercial or international Jew, the banker Jew. So there was a group called the Christian Front, and this is from a socialist labor collection, and it was calling the Coughlinites neo-Nazis or stormtroopers, and you can see a little swastika there. And they were calling this little Catholic segment the face of American fascism, the Christian Front and Protestants.